As news broke over the weekend about the imminent collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank, on Monday came a raft of disclosures to the Australian Stock Exchange from largely tech companies that had cash deposits in the bank. As it turned out, their fear of loss was saved by the US government stepping in and guaranteeing all deposits. But the reason so many had money there was because of an Australian venture capital company called Blackbird, which has a close relationship with SVB. This week I spoke with Blackbird's partner, Michael Tolo, who spent much of his career in finance in the Silicon Valley.
You know, Blackbird's had a wonderful relationship with many people there. They've been a supporter of many community events and programs that we run. But beyond that, Silicon Valley Bank's been a provider of financial services to certain of our portfolio companies.
So that being the case, just explain its demise, its collapse into administration effectively, and then potentially bankruptcy. Just what impact does that have on your customers?
Yeah, certainly. So, the reality is that, the Australian startup ecosystem has been relatively insulated from the downfall of SVB over the last week. Relative to US peers, the vast majority of our companies, in particular those with local headquarters, had deposits held in domestic banks. Certainly we did have a number of companies that have offshore operations or headquarters based in the US in particular that were affected, but they were in the handful, rather than some meaningful proportion of, the overall portfolio.
And so when the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation stepped in, the banking regulator, and took control, and then the government said, we will actually honour every deposit inside that account, that would have been of great relief to some of these companies. It wasn't necessarily, in many cases, 100% of the capital they had, but it was certainly at least enough to hurt.
Absolutely, and there was a small number of companies, predominantly those at the seed or Series A stage, that were unfortunately caught in the position where substantially all of their deposits were held with SVB, and there was a question of how we would, as partners alongside them, get them to payroll. So it was a situation that no one necessarily had foreseen. It was certainly an unwelcome moment and an uncomfortable moment, but definitely there were sighs of relief. Breathed. In my case, as I landed back, in Melbourne from San Francisco upon hearing that news.
So I was going to say that you've spent time in your career in the Silicon Valley with venture capital. Just explain why the Silicon Valley Bank was such a strategically important bank, not only its position, but also its customer base.
So the customer base for Silicon Valley Bank was uniquely concentrated in, call it, early stage technology companies. And, as a result, I suppose it had a direct incentive to produce bespoke products, financial products for that ecosystem, whether it be, debt for certain companies, bespoke debt for companies running, particular business models, including, hardware as a service business models that weren't available elsewhere, or whether it be providing personal finance to founders, whose substantial wealth was tied up in, the equity that they held in the companies that they ran. So it was this pure focus on servicing founders, on servicing technology companies that did really hold it apart.
So does its demise leave a gap in venture capital in the future in terms of startups, both here in Australia, but certainly in the United States?
Yeah, the most important thing to note is, venture debt or, financing provided by SVB is only a marginal source of funding for the startup ecosystem, worldwide, or even if we speak very specifically about the US, substantially all of the funding for these companies is provided by venture capital, and really pleasingly, the supply of venture capital hasn't been affected or constrained by the events of the last week.
And so given also that there has been the knock-on to Credit Suisse and there's been concerns about other banks, particularly European banks, this is about the appetite for risk right now, the appetite even for people to go and fund venture capital. What do you sense that might be like in the wake of this crisis?
I suspect that, if we dive specifically into what appears to have happened at SVB, The focus over the last few days in particular has been the idea of an operational liquidity mismatch rather than some fundamental breakdown in, the value of, assets held on the balance sheet, whether through venture debt, whether through investment in venture funds, or whether through, equity held via converted warrants in companies directly. So I think from our perspective, it's an operational activity, certainly, more broadly, and for a couple of months, so far this year, there has been a little bit of a risk-off appetite, but, I think fundamentally venture capital plays such an important part financing, future productivity gains. Here in Australia, certainly in the US, absolutely. And I do firmly believe that it has a wonderful place in institutional portfolios, notwithstanding the events of the recent past.
Well, you've been involved in many deep tech businesses as they've got off the ground and got started, and it's quite clear in areas such as artificial intelligence. You can see it in driverless vehicles coming down the line, in terms of the energy transition that will come. But this is going to be largely as a result of innovation that's driven from the venture capital areas. I mean, it's trying not to stop those areas of innovation if there is, as you call it, a risk-off situation.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think over time, the supply of funding into venture capital, remains sturdy. We're lucky to have, a range of, supporters through our LP base who understand its value. And, I think, more broadly in terms of, the ongoing economic development of Australia as a nation, recent government policy announcements, including the National Reconstruction Fund, I think reflect that alignment in the belief that the development of new technology, whether it's in frontier technologies, call it, synthetic biology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, as you flagged, will be a critical pillar of the country's economic development over the next decades. So continuing to fund consistently and reliably is critical.
Michael Tolo, partner at Blackbird Ventures. We always appreciate your time and many thanks for it today.
Excellent. Very nice to speak.